Hi, everyone. Today we are going to be talking about understanding inheritance. Remember that heredity is referring to the passing on of traits from parents to offspring. Heredity is the reason that we look like our parents because we got specific traits from them. And remember that a trait is a specific characteristic or feature exhibited by an organism. Now, traits can be physical things that we can see, like our skin color, our eye color, our hair color. Um, Traits can also be physical things that we can't see, like a genetic disorder, a disease, or a blood type. Traits can even be behavioral things like cognitive ability or how social we are. Behavioral traits are a little bit more complicated because they're often also shaped by environment, but it is important to note that genetic traits can be very different and they can be visible or they can be invisible. We can't talk about inheritance in terms of genetics without talking about this guy, Gregor Mendel. Gregor Mendel was a monk, but he was also a meteorologist and a biologist and a mathematician and a botanist. And he was really interested in pea plants. He looked at their specific traits and he came up with some really important conclusions about genetics because of the pea plants. And this is important because for thousands of years, farmers and herders, so people who managed animals, have been trying to create hybrids by crossing different organisms because they're trying to get specific traits. But for a really long time, this was kind of a hit or miss. So people wanted a specific type of dog, but they had no idea how to get that type of dog. So they would just cross a bunch of different kinds and hope for the best. So Gregor Mendel came up with some really important conclusions about inheritance and about traits that have allowed us to become as knowledgeable about genetics as we are today. Now, why pea plants? Well, pea plants can reproduce very easily and very quickly. So that means that we can look at multiple generations in a short period of time. And pea plants have easy to observe traits. So, for example, pea plants either have purple or white flowers. These flowers are either axial, which means on the side, or terminal on the top or at the ends. Seed color can be yellow or green. Seed shape can be round or wrinkled. Pod shape can be inflated or constricted. Pod color can be green or yellow. Stem length can be tall or short. Pea plants can reproduce by self-fertilization, and they can also be crossed with one another. And this is important because this is how we get true breeding pea plants or purebred. And in order to understand how genes get passed down from generation to generation, we really need to be sure that we have purebred pea plants for specific traits. So take a look at this diagram here. What Mendel did is he got some purebred yellow peas and he crossbred these plants with purebred green peas. So we'll call this the parent generation, purebred yellow crossed with purebred green. When Mendel did this cross, he noticed that the first filial generation or F1 generation were all yellow. So there was not one single green pea in that first generation. However, when he allowed this F1 generation to self-fertilize, he noticed that the next generation, the second filial generation or F2 generation, the green peas came back. And so what he also noticed in that they came back in a very specific ratio. So take a look at this diagram here. Again, we see the parent generation, yellow crossed with green. The F1 generation ended up being all yellow. Then the F2 generation is when we saw the green come back. Now, the important thing to note here is that in this F2 generation, we saw a 3-to-1 ratio of yellow to green. And when Mendel did a bunch of different trials, he found this 3-to-1 ratio coming back again and again and again. And so this pattern is what led him to come up with the concept of dominant versus recessive traits, which we'll talk about a little bit later. And it also allowed him to come up with some pretty important conclusions about how traits get inherited. So here are his conclusions. First of all, he figured out that inheritance is determined by invisible units or factors, and we now call these units or factors genes. The second conclusion he came up with was that we inherit one unit or gene from each parent for each trait. And lastly, these traits are invisible, but they can still be passed down to the next generation. Now, we take these conclusions that Mendel came up with and we come up with Mendel's laws. That would be the law of segregation, which states that two alleles separate when gametes form. So if a parent has, remember, two traits or two genes for a specific trait, they're going to get separated when the gametes form. So gametes can get separate genes for any given trait. And the second law is the law of independent assortment, which means that alleles of different genes separate independently from other genes. So in our case of pea plants, the seed color has nothing to do with the flower color, which has nothing to do with the stem length, which has nothing to do with the pod shape. So same thing for us, our eye color has nothing to do with our skin color, which has nothing to do with our hair color, which has nothing to do with our musical ability in terms of how the alleles separated as they get passed from our parents to us. And that's it for this first portion of the lesson. Stay tuned for part 2, which will be coming up next.